Hey guys, Alicia from Morning Hawk Creations here. Now I feel bad for telling you this, but I feel I should disclose it because I did say I was going to be more regular about my tutorials and installments. This would be the brand new camcorder that I got to replace that which I'm recording on, which is my Canon. My Canon is meant for still photography, not video. The new camcorder I got it's a Sony, and I've been having nothing but nightmares with it, so I've got the tutorial filmed that I managed to do on the Sony. But we're back to doing the introduction with the Canon, so I apologize for the delays in the videos, but that Canon's been shutting off on me randomly, and so I went with the Sony, and the Sony, I'm just still figuring this out. Alright, on to the video. Okay, so this introduction is for a hybrid speed demo slash tutorial. The reason it's a speed demo is because it's a finished piece. It's a finished composites piece. It's not meant to be just, this is how you execute this, this is not just technique. When I get done with this, this one will be up for sale. It's done on 11 by 14. Strathmore smooth paper, so that's the paper for all you guys that love to ask me what kind of paper I'm using. Normally it doesn't matter, because I'm using this sketchbook. This is my tutorial sketchbook, and it's literally just a sketching pad. And this one it matters, so it's Strathmore smooth. Okay, 11 by 14 is the size. It is a composite piece, so the resource pictures come from the 2014 Midwest Horse Fair, from the breed demo that the Halflingers did. The Halflingers chose to back up the history of the Halflinger breed by doing the Sound of Music. Now that sounds really strange. The Midwest Horse Fair every year does a theme, like the 2015 theme was the future of the horse. The 2014 theme was horse tales, so they went big stories. In fact, the fjords went with, wait for it, Frozen. Because there was a fjord in Frozen. The Halflingers, however, decided to call back on their ancestry and went back to Austria and northern Italy, and they went with the Sound of Music. I'm sure everybody has seen the Disney version of the Sound of Music. But there was no Halflingers in the Sound of Music. So they rolled out with, you know, Julie Andrews singing, and a pair of horses being the Nazi horses that were pursuing the Von Trapp family, and then different riders or handlers or pairs of horses being different aspects or characters in the movie. One of the sets of horses that they had was, or one of the horses that they had in a set of handlers were a pair of women dressed as nuns, and I think they were supposed to represent the monastery where the main character came from. There was a lot of chaos. In fact, if I can, I will cut to chestnut color with a flaxen mane. Sometimes it's considered a liver chestnut, so a kind of cooler chestnut. We're going to be doing this in graphite, so it won't matter if it's a liver chestnut or a regular chestnut, because it's going to be black and white. Alright, so as I said, this is going to be a composite piece. So the shot that I'm using is going to come from the Halflinger breed demo from the 2014 Midwest Horse Fair. The building references and structural references for the backdrop are going to be from Holy Hill the National Shrine of Mary. I like to call it the Holy Hill Basilica out in Hubertus, Wisconsin. So we're going to have a distant shot of the church that's probably about 3-4 miles away that we're going to put way at the top of the layout, and then we're going to bring the hillside down, and then in order to keep it not looking like a castle, because I don't want them to look like a castle, and churches have a tendency of resembling castles, so I don't want it to look like a castle. We're going to incorporate some of the landscaping elements that they have around Holy Hill Basilica in order to bring the nuns with the carriage in with the background, in with the way background. So as I said, composite piece, and it is going to be a finished piece. So big points here. We've got 3 different kinds of lighting. We've got outdoor lighting, and we have Coliseum lighting. The 11 by 14 Strathmore Smooth. So in this case, because of the scale of the main focus, which is the horse and the nuns, those nuns, their faces, their whole face is about the size of my finger. So that's why we went with the Strathmore Smooth and not rough sketch paper. If you blend on this rough sketch paper, you get the rough, coarse texture. You're not going to get that fine detail. And as it is, because the faces of these nuns are so small, I skipped filming the execution of the heads and the faces of those nuns, because no matter how many times I tried to really get in there and get the fine, like the white behind, around their eyes, and one of the nuns is wearing glasses, I didn't feel comfortable enough to actually execute that as a tutorial, so I executed it, and then we're coming back and we're going to go with the horses, the harness, and the rig for the harness, the carriage, and then executing the background with elements of Holy Hill Basilica and the Basilica itself. Pencils wise, because I know you guys always ask me about my pencils, we're going with the carbon pencil for my hardest. Second hardest is going to be the HB. And the third one is going to be the 4B, so we're skipping the 6, we're skipping the 8. So carbon, HB, 4B, and then we're just using the standard run of blending stumps, tortillons, and of course my very favorite kneaded eraser. I'm going to pop in every once in a while with some shots from both photo shoots, so you guys don't get bored. And this is going to be multiple installments. This one episode is going to be about 40 minutes, and I'm doing a voiceover because it's time-lapse. So while my hand's going to be like it does when I'm doing a time-lapse, at least I'll give you the guys the pleasure of being able to listen to me ramble about what my thought process is as I'm going through this without having to sit for 15 hours of me. This is a face. This is still a face. This is a muzzle. Yeah. Now we're going to do tack, because that's fun. So we're going to kind of try and speed this up. Hopefully we'll be able to get the horse and the buggy done in 1 or 2 episodes. I have half the horse done now for the first installment. Possibly the end of the carriage, so your main subject done in like 2.5, 3 episodes. And then we're going to go into the background and the basilica. So I hope you guys really enjoy this. It's going to be a complex build for me as far as layout and composition. And hopefully you guys will be able to take what I'm doing and apply it to your own work. Okay. So I do apologize. I did start this piece well before I actually started recording it as a tutorial, so we're starting a little bit late.
Starting off after I had already gone in and laid down the base tones for this halflinger, going in with the carbon pencil. And if you take a look at the strokes, I will be kind of trying to keep in line and keep in mind the directionality of the way the fur grows on the face. Going in and defining the right cheekbone and the part of the bridle that goes along the side of the face. The shaft is made up of two materials. One is metal and the other one is wood. So in this case, because it's so small, I mean it's barely bigger than the tip of the blending stump, it was really important to make sure that I didn't go outside of my lines. And because the shafts for this cart were tipped in either steel or probably aluminum, something lightweight but durable, so it could have very well been steel. I couldn't at this point put in a heavy shadow underneath the tip of it where it's tipped in silver metal. I can always go in darker, but it's really hard to go in lighter. And I am kind of jumping back and forth between the surrounding equipment and the horse, keeping in mind my tonal values there. Shadow I'm working on right now is the one that defines the bridge of the flat forehead area going into the bridge of the nose, keeping my directionality in place with the line of the strokes. Sorry, in line with the strokes. A little bit of a macro shot so you can actually see what I'm doing here. And this is 3 times as fast as I like what the reality of it is. So, and this is shot with the new camera and the new overdub equipment. So, trying everything out a little bit here. Now it's not so much that I was making a mistake with the white stripe in the middle of the face, but I did want to kind of pick up an area where I felt that the spiral was in the fur, and so even if the rest of the face stays relatively white, I wanted that to be a little bit darker. Believe it or not, this tiny little area took me over 45 minutes to do. And this is just, it is a central point in the piece, but overall, this fine little detail is probably going to be majorly overlooked. But it's important to me and could be important to somebody else. Working on the under part of the mane. Halflingers have a really thick mane like a fjord does, and it might be from the conditions that they're bred in, that kind of northern environment, but they have a very thick, heavy, bushy mane, like a halflinger. It's not a very thin mane like an Arabian, or maybe I would say a medium mane like like a quarter horse or a Morgan. They have a very bushy mane and it's very full. So the thought is to put in some undertones and some shadow underneath it so that when I go back in I can make it look a little bit fuller. One of the things that was really hard about this is this was shot across the Colosseum, and as you can see, I don't even have a reference relief for this horse's other eye, and it's entirely possible that in fact I think it's true that the the blinds from the bridle were actually covering the eye, so it was really hard to figure out exactly where they were supposed to be and were they being blocked by the mane? Were they being blocked by the blinders? So this gets into some really quality reference shots, of which in this point I like the shot that I had, but this was one of the arguments that I had to moving into a DSLR. The tack on this horse is all black, it's not brown, and I would say it was kind of a buff. It wasn't a high sheen, flashy style tack. Mostly I would say it was a pretty traditional tack. So no fancy metal works, it wasn't a high polish. It was like a working tack. Kind of defining the blaze down the face. And trying to walk that fine line. As I said in the introduction, halflingers are considered to be a chestnut or liver chestnut horse. So it's that fine line in black and white. It's that fine line in black and white between going too dark and going too white and too light, and actually finding the right tones to convey the right color. Typically, if you look at what's really common is pictures of old farm horses, which is hard to determine what the color of those horses was or were. But really easy to find are pictures of race horses like War Horse and Secretariat and that, and find the old black and whites where you can see the registered color. Like Secretariat was a really red chestnut, and see how they look in black and white, then you can kind of think of how that will affect the tone of your painting. You can easily just transfer them into a black and white image, but with this one, because it's a composite, and there's so many different factors that I'm literally going to have to play with this as I'm going along bit by bit. And going in, have defined the nostrils there. And now I've got this tricky little part of this halflinger's nose where it flares out for the nostrils, flares out and up, flares down into a dip in between the nostrils themselves, and then comes back out for the lip itself. This in particular halflinger has a very blonde nose, and you actually lose the definition of where the stripe is on the nose, and lose the definition of all the color, really. I mean, it's kind of a yellow, kind of buff colored nose. It's not necessarily pink, but it's not white either, so it might have been the way that my camera interpreted the color. And trying to be as clean and accurate as possible. Now keep in mind, just like in the cat tutorials, where on the face your coarser hair is closer to the forehead and the cheeks and the eyes and not so much near the nose, a horse's nose is actually very soft and very velvety. The fur there is exceptionally fine. So mindful to keep the strokes less dynamic with less contrast to get the softness to come through in the image. That's also a lot of soft that's also a lot of soft tissue there. That's the word I was looking for. That's a lot of soft tissue there. Not a lot of hard bone or I would say muscle mass on that nose, although of course there is muscles there, but they're not the hard working big muscles like you would find like on a flank and its shoulder. Starting to define some of the muscle tone on the inner side of the right leg. and defining some more of the harnessing. Through the course of this tutorial, and I know I sound so entertained when I'm on this, but through the course of this tutorial, we're going to get all the way through this shoulder section here. We're going to get the bridle done, and I believe get a full get a full leg done, if not two. And I'm doing an awful lot of work with the carbon and the HB when it comes to the horse itself. When it comes to the tack, however, because it has to be so much darker and such almost the darkest values that I need in this this piece, I'm reserving that 4B for the tack. Getting into the harness and the bit. This is a little bit of tricky work, and I found it a little bit confusing. In fact, I had to work with several different reference pictures on this because the shot was confusing. It wasn't very crisp and clear. I might have or I might not have done better if I was shooting in RAW. But there was so much going on between the bridle, the rein, and that breast piece that and the angle that the horse was coming at, that it was really hard to define where the horse's lip was, where the bit was, where the side of the bit was, that whole 9 yards, and where it came into the rein. And this is stuff that as you're going through, you kind of have to troubleshoot and figure out and kind of just go from there. And this is why it's a speed tutorial and not a step-by-step, look, I think this is part of the bridle, it's black. It's a black shape followed with a black shape. It'd be 10 minutes of me going, I think, Believe it or not, when I was doing this in real time, I actually was narrating it. And then I hit that snag, and then I realized I had mostly started the nuns, and I had started most of this horse's face, and I was like, this is just not working. But I did want to kind of share with you guys the mentality that I'm going through as I'm going through this, because this is going to be a really complex piece. It's got a lot of different layers and reference pictures involved, and I get to play with all the new equipment I have for doing these tutorials. So again, getting back into contrast, see when I'm doing this, I almost want to put my finger on the screen and point to the parts I'm talking about, but over in the shoulder now you can kind of see where I've broken away from the reference picture, and if I forget to do it, somebody please message me that I forgot to put the reference picture in this, because it's kind of important. On the reference picture, it's not very well defined between the horse's face and the horse's shoulder, and it has to do with the angle of the light, how fast the horse was moving, and the amount of distance between the shoulder and the head. And while it's probably close to a foot, it's really important for me to keep that line right there. See, I was pointing out that I was edging the kneaded eraser, because in the picture there wasn't a lot of contrast between the horse's head and its shoulder again, and I really wanted, it was important to pull that horse's face forward from the breast and the shoulder. I want it to look tucked, but I do not want it to look like it's resting its head into its effective breastbone. And there is a highlight there in the shot, but it's a very faint highlight, and I really wanted to accent it. A little bit more shadow on that shoulder, and we're going to push that shoulder right back. So now this is a really kind of good point, because we're going into the shoulder and into some of this other area, but right there is a really good illustration of being able to use contrast and texture when you're executing your materials and using your pencils and your blending stumps. Because if you look at the forehead, it looks very well textured, and there is a lot of contrast versus the nose and the softness of the nose and how the nose looks really velvety. And in the background, right below that, you have that foreleg, that right foreleg, and I didn't get real in-depth with detail in that foreleg right there, because the inside of the leg is really just kind of like it's kind of like the nose, where it's real fine and it's made up underneath a very hard muscle and tissue, and there is bone there, but the inside fur seems to be much more supple than the outside fur, which seems to be a bit grainier. Also, the light is softer, which is a really important thing to point out, because you don't have direct harsh light, you're not going to have a lot of hard edges. A soft light would not pick up a lot of the texture with like the face, where you can tell the directionality of the fur on the face or which way the swirl on the forehead goes. And just using my blending stumps to go through and define some of the muscle. And I kind of jump back and forth because I'm afraid of getting a little bit too light in that shoulder. I mean, this one was a really light chestnut. In fact, I had to actually look it up because I was tempted on calling them a dun, because to me a chestnut is quite a bit darker and redder, and these are almost blonde looking horses. Here becomes kind of that interesting argument in my head where I'm trying to figure out how the tack is laying, because I have the side of a bit right there that goes back up into the reins that go up and across its back, and it's difficult to figure out what piece is what and what direction it's facing, because the rein itself twists because the horse is actually turning into its shoulder. And so I was trying to make a decision on how much of that detail in the rein was going to show up, how much of it I was going to include, how much of it was just going to be overkill. I mean, all this fine detail can be appreciated as you're watching me execute it. However, in the vastness of this piece, because there's an awful lot that's going into this piece, it's not just this one study, it's not just a head study like you guys are kind of used to me doing. There's a lot of elements involved. I had to take a measurement of how important the detailing in the harness and the bridle and all the tack was going to be, how important that was into telling the whole story of that I needed to tell in this piece. So I have black on black with a chestnut horse. And the trick here is conveying the smoothness of the leather, the buffness of the leather, against a very paler color. I wouldn't say pale to the point where it was almost white, but significantly paler than black, obviously. Still being able to retain the kind of buff luster and the finish of that tack with the many different textures and curvatures of the tack, and then have the contrast of the muscles of the horse underneath it. Whereas normally I would say, keep your, it's like with doing fur, you want to keep your lines with the directionality of the fur. When you're doing smooth material, it's good to keep your lines going with the source of your light. So in this case, because I have a highlight coming back toward the back of the shoulder, I wanted to make sure I'm fading it back, that we're reinforcing the shadow line. In fact, back here, because he is turning into the weight of the wagon and the weight of the cart behind him in his harness, it is pushing into his shoulder, and that is important to be consistent with the reality of the shot. So not only is the lighting important, but the weight behind the materials. It's important to keep that in mind and convey the heaviness behind that material. And while it looks like I'm just randomly pulling out shapes, I am following my picture, and if you have paid attention, you've noticed my guidelines. There is no guidelines to tell me where those muscles in his shoulder are, but it's important for there to be highlights and lowlights in the muscle structure of this horse's shoulder, because he is leaning into the weight, and if I just make it a flat color, there's no strain on his muscles. You don't see the tendons straining and the muscles flexing in order to tell the story of the weight that he's pulling. Right now I could probably leave it and it would make a decent abstract, but once we pull back and you see that there's a lot more to it, you can kind of see why I said at some point I had to pick and choose which details I was keeping, which details I was choosing to abandon. Shading down that blaze on his face just a little bit. It was a little bit too white and overlooking the whole piece. A little too stark. So we've got to put in and account for the shadow underneath that mane. Like I said, halflingers have a really, really thick mane. It's just like a little horsey afro on their head, except that horses don't have really curly manes. So unless you're dealing with a curly horse, they have those. All that hair just barely contained by that headband. And now the harder part here was I realized that I didn't have the other blinder in. I had gone back and forth about keeping it, because I didn't want to lose the eye that I did manage to capture, and then I realized that if I didn't have it, it really wouldn't tell a complete picture of the story. So putting in the other blinder. putting in the headband that barely contains all that fluffy mane. Trying to keep this interesting. I have those who are fascinated watching me draw, and then I actually have to explain what I'm doing, and then I have to think about it. And then I kind of go, this is kind of boring. So a little bit of the mane, the forelock section of the mane. And there is a two-part band to this piece of equipment. One helps to keep the blinders around the horse's eyes, and the other one helps to contain it to its head. So a standard headband that would go around the ears, and then one that keeps the blinders in place. And the blinders, for those who are not horse savvy, the blinders keep the horse from getting distracted and spooking. Because horses can see 180 degrees, whereas I think people can see 120, so they have a wider range of peripheral vision, and they can get distracted or they can get spooked easily, and so they put blinders on them so that if they're tied up to the rig, they're less likely to spook and hurt themselves or wreck the rig or any one of a number of things. And having driven horses, they're all very valid concerns. A horse that spooks with a rig behind it is a very dangerous thing to have happen for both the horse and for the person in the cart and for the cart itself. Kind of trying to work on the overall shapes and muscle textures within the legs. I'm most likely going, I can almost guarantee you, because that strap that goes down below the two front legs is much heavier than that. But at the moment, I'm focused on legs, so the whole point between this and the head was just to get to the end of the legs. Defining the knee area and the lower foreleg. Give a little bit of weight to that leg by making it a little bit darker than the upper leg. And in with the carbon pencil and the HB to define the hoof and the edge of the hoof. Again, number one rule, lots of contrast attracts the eye. If you want something to look hard or coarse or sharp, if you want the eye to be drawn to it, lots of contrast. Use a lot of hard edges. Now, by no means are we going to be finishing out this horse in this installment. We will be finishing up, I believe, just this front leg, and then we're going to be checking out for this installment. This has already been 30 minutes, so we'll be ending at about 40. I want to try and keep them manageable. We will be probably going back over this front end again and then just tweaking it as we go, hardening up some of these edges, and doing some small minor adjustments just to make these forelegs pop a little bit more. Getting into the left front hoof. Halflingers are not necessarily a feathered breed. Feathering is not part of their breed standard. Although I did notice a few halflingers with a little bit of feathering. They don't have the typical cleaned, trimmed legs as you would see like on a quarter horse or an Arabian. There is a little bit of feathering down there, but it's not, to the best of my knowledge, part of their breed standard. Again, they are a light draft breed, but they are still a draft horse, so they don't have dainty little feet. They've kind of got dish pan hooves, and they're wide, and they're not so tall, and they're pretty flat looking. Kind of defining my foreground where I'm going to end that hoof and bringing it down. Start a little bit on the first girth. Going in with that 4B. You want to know what's funny is I'm watching myself do this in high speed, and I saw the fleck of charcoal that was on the white of the paper, and reflexively I'm blowing at it like I'm going to fix it. That's actually pretty funny. You guys can all have a good laugh at that, because I'm laughing at that. Just like, get off my paper. And down into the final stretch, we're coming pretty much toward the end, so we're just gonna leave it here. Thanks a lot for watching, everybody. Again, there's going to be another installment coming up. Got to show you a couple of the shots that I took when the Halflingers did their presentation in 2014, and that was for the Horsetails theme. It was part of their presentation for The Sound of Music. I don't know if I show any video because it's got copyright audio recording, if it's going to let me play it, but we will try. Thanks a lot.